Chapter 4. Not too much to go on. Back at the morgue, Mrs. Monahan helped Shake make Xerox copies of every inch of coverage in those first editions of the Tribune. Brad had lent his reporter's notebook to the pair. The pages were copied. Armed with this information, and there was little else to go on, Shake went back to Hudson and Armitage and sat and thought. That night he tried to sleep. He wasn't sure what he was getting himself into, but he could not wipe the recurring image of that vandalized house and Brad's vivid descriptions and the broadcast photos of Mr. and Mrs. Snyder from his mind. He did not sleep well at all. The next day he kept mulling over the events in his mind and the few clues the police had found and what Brad had relayed to his readers. Quoting from his report, "The Snyders were beaten to death with what was thought to have been a tire iron. Amid the blood found on Mr. Snyder's skull was a tiny smear of motor oil or grease from the instrument that had killed him. The tire iron would later be found in a hedge along the alley. The Snyders' home was apparently invaded while the pair was eating dinner. The unfinished remnants of the meal still there, a carton of milk not put away, butter melting in a dish. The culprits that night, and it would soon to be assumed that there were two of them, had come and gone quickly. The Snyders might not have suffered much, but no one can be sure." A psychologist told the newspaper that even if both Mr. and Mrs. Snyder had been struck down by only 2 consecutive blows, for one horrible split second, the second victim would have been aware of his or her partner's fate and knew that he or she was next. There was no way to put any kind of gentle or positive spin on what had happened that night. Neighbors had said it was not uncommon for the Snyders to not lock their house, even when they were away. They were known for welcoming in lost kids and battered wives and others needing quick shelter. The generosity of the Snyders was legendary around their neighborhood. They had for years offered their home for local meetings of all kinds, and not just Jewish groups and functions. Of course, they had been supporters of Jewish charities and active in fundraisers. Just weeks before their murders, they were the subject of a feature article in the weekend religion section of the Tribune. It profiled their lives in Chicago. It had lots of happier times and testimonials. As children, they had suffered through life in the Buchenwald concentration camp. They had both seen General Patton and his 6th Armored Division enter the camp. Both had seen the still-alive remaining emaciated inmates struggle to embrace their liberators. In recent years, they had met one of the soldiers who was there at a meeting of the Holocaust Survivors Group at a Chicago synagogue. Among the speakers was Jimmy Weldon. He had by that time become better known as one of the voice artists at Hanna-Barbera cartoons. He was the voice of the little duck Yankee Doodle in 100 cartoons in the Yogi Bear show, and he had become a motivational speaker. After Weldon's speech, the Snyders had gone up to talk to him. They told him that they, both as children, had been there at Buchenwald. "If you had waited a day or two longer," Mrs. Snyder told Weldon, "I would have been dead. My husband and I owe you and all the American soldiers our lives." The three embraced and wept. Ephraim and Miriam Schneider had not met until they were both young adults and were in America. Both, with the help of a very large Chicago-based resettlement group, would end up in the Windy City. Both would find new homes because of Jewish organizations. Each had distant cousins in the area who aided and directed them to the States. Their cousins had come years before, fleeing the early persecution of Hitler in the 30s, just as many other thousands of European Jews had done. The list is impressive. Likely best known, of course, was scientist Albert Einstein. Others included Nobel Prize winners, symphony conductors, noted rabbis, musicians, painters, teachers, and a score of others who would enrich the American culture. The Snyders had met while attending the University of Chicago. After a long courtship and eventual marriage, they settled in the Chicago suburbs and lived generous but quiet, unassuming lives. Ephraim Snyder became a successful businessman, working in global imports. The Snyder home was filled with a variety of ornaments and tapestries from all around the world. None of that was touched by the killers. Apparently, their only prey was human, and they had done their jobs quickly. Marion Snyder worked for the Jewish Federation of Chicago as a counselor. The Tribune article had described them as being, quote, survivors of a horrific childhood who had come to America and become a model for others who suffered oppression. They are both survivors and crusaders. The sad feeling around the newspaper, though, Mrs. Monahan had told Shake, was that the killers had discovered their anti-Semitic targets by reading about the Snyders in the paper. Its author, Will Clough, was nearly inconsolable as he spoke in the lunchroom about the article. He had spent a day on the north side with the Snyders prior to putting the article together. Now the Snyders were making news in the Trib again, this time for a sadly different reason. The paper reported that the official police investigation showed no signs of forced entry in the house. The killers just likely went through the unlocked back door, which opened onto the kitchen. The couple was eating that evening. We know that from the condition of the kitchen table when police arrived that they were simply eating. A neighbor had first discovered the brutal killing when the Schneider's cat, Shelby, had constantly screeched and scratched at her back door. When she entered the Schneider's home, she collapsed. After regaining her feet, she called the police. They were there minutes later. It all happened so quickly. Another neighbor said she had seen a black car in the alley behind the Snyder's house. Then a couple of minutes later, it was gone. There had been enough time for the killers to enter the house, bludgeon the couple to death, go to the front of the house, and spray paint a swastika on the wall. The cruel killers had apparently taken nothing except 2 precious lives. The one neighbor who had seen the car gave no additional information other than an estimate of the time, 7:10 p.m., and the color of the car, black. A low hedge around the back of the Snyder's house all but obscured the neighbor's view of the car. Police, though, had come up with at least something. Although they found no dustable fingerprints at the home, they did manage to take a plaster mold of one of the tire tracks left by the car. It was obvious the vehicle had stopped for a while. Then, when it started, its front tire spun in the mud of the alley, left wet from an afternoon rain. Police surmised the driver was anxious to get out of the area. A normal takeoff would not have spun the tires. But more than 2 feet of tire track was clear and able to be copied. The tires were brand new, They were 175/70/14s. But that tire size fits 1,000,000 cars in Chicago. But a sticker that the tire shop had left on one of the tires was apparently still on the tread. The sticker obscured a small rectangular section of the tread. If that car could be found quickly, the sticker might still be there. If the tread matched, that would cinch a positive identification. Then 48 hours later, a breakthrough. A 1968 black Ford Escort was found abandoned in a no-parking zone near a rail station on the edge of downtown. The car had brand new tires. One of the tires still had a sticker on the tread. The tread matched the mold from Mr. and Mrs. Schneider's back alley. Finally, a lead. As expected, the car had been stolen. Brad called Judge Shake to tell him, "I hope to hell they used 5 pounds of dusting powder on that car," the judge blurted out. "Yes, Kurt, the police think, though, that the assailants wore gloves. It is my bet from past experience that they will find prints of the owner of the car and other riders and nothing else. This may be a dead end, but it is all we have right now. In my years at the paper, I've learned one thing about crime. With the passage of time, somebody eventually talks, or some small clue that went overlooked at first will be found, and the pieces will begin to go together." "I hope you're right, Brad," the judge said. "At this point, we know a few things. One, we know the crime was committed just after 7 the other night. 2, it was assumed that 2 people did the dirty work. 3, we know the motive was anti-Jewish hatred, and the painting of that orange swastika on the front of the house is part of the evidence. 4, we know the getaway car was stolen and parked at a transit station. And 5, we know that a tire iron was the murder weapon. Mr. Snyder's skull had a slight smear of motor oil on it next to the wound. I think that's about it. Well, Kurt, some cases have been solved with a lot less to go on. We just need to stay focused on this. I'll give you a call the very instant anything else comes up." Brad Gibson suddenly realized that for only the second time in his career, he was starting to get emotionally involved in a story. He remembered, though, that first week at the Trib when one of the older editors warned him that that would happen now and then. Dick Rossi had worked for the paper much of his adult life, but he still was assigned to nights and weekends. "I was never considered competent enough to work the big desk during the busy parts of the week," he told Brad. "So it's not prime time, but I'm at the Trib." During his cub years at the paper, Brad had worked a lot of those nights and weekends. He found Rossi a good mentor. He was there the night Rossi died of a heart attack. It was just after he had cautioned Gibson never to get too involved in a story. Join me again for the next part of Return to Nuremberg.